Right, good evening ladies and gentlemen, it's Anthony Carpenter here on, I've now lost count on how long we've been in lockdown because it seems like ages, but actually in the grand scheme of things we are still in very early April. So, and yeah, it's a struggle for a lot of us. I've just been out for my mandated daily walk and walking up and down Cherry Hinton Road and seeing notice after notice after notice on all of the shop windows basically saying we are closed until permanent, until further notice, is quite sobering. I think in particularly with the takeaways and the food outlets, nearly all of them are now shut down, and those that aren't shut down are only doing takeaway and collections only. I tried with one last night actually, and unfortunately it wasn't nearly as good, certainly for the amount of money I paid for it, so I'm wondering if I'm going to be doing that again. Anyway, this video is going to be all about this book. It is the Directory of Cambridge, known as the Blue Book, from 1937. It's an incredible snapshot of what Cambridge was like in the run-up to the Second World War. And one of the what I'm going to do with this one is actually I'm going to introduce it in kind of 2 or 3 parts, because one of the things, and it's a shame we don't actually have these annual guides for our towns and cities anymore, not least because it would probably breach the Data Protection Act, is because we will never get those snapshots. And actually for historians this is a really useful place to keep all of the information that basically describes or gives a picture of what a place was like at a given moment in time. Now, the first photograph that you're going to see is this one. It is the Mayor of Cambridge, His Worship the Mayor of Cambridge, Alderman William Leighton Briggs, JP, Justice of the Peace. He was actually better known as Bill Briggs, the first Labour councillor to be elected the Mayor of Cambridge by his fellow councillors. Now, what's really interesting about this in particular at this time was that Cambridge for centuries was dominated by the establishment, a conservative establishment, and it's only really been in recent decades that has been completely changed. Now, what we see on the succeeding pages are photographs of each of the individual councillors. Now, we've got something similar in for our city and county councils. It's kind of just this big poster which is put up in places that the public can see, but not necessarily in places that the public might necessarily frequent, which is one of the reasons why I think that actually things like that should actually be up in places in particular where people wait, such as bus stops or surgeries and things like that. I'm going to have a look at the first 2 that I'm going to introduce, because these are the ones who for me really stand out in the local news reports. Now, these 2 chaps stood for Parliament. The first one is Dr. Alex Wood, and the second one is Mr. Albert Stubbs. Alex Wood was the leader of the Cambridge Labour Party throughout the 1930s. He was a teetotaler, he was a Presbyterian minister at St Columba's on Downing Street in Cambridge, and he was also a scientist. He was a physicist from Scotland, and came down to Cambridge, and he was across the road from his church at Emmanuel College, and he was in Cambridge for a good half a century, if I recall correctly. Absolute devout pacifist in the George Lansbury mould. Just opposed war in all circumstances, which made things a little bit awkward towards the end of the 1930s when fascism was a really, really serious threat, and he was still opposing measurements on rearmament. Albert Stubbs was, as you can probably see from the photograph, was as solid a working class councillor as you could get. And he actually stood for Parliament for Labour for Cambridge County, what is today South Cambridgeshire, and he got elected in the landslide that brought in Clement Attlee's government. I don't know whether he was expecting to get elected, but he did. One of the groups of politicians that we had, one of the party groupings that we had, which has been unfortunately long forgotten about, was the group known as the Women's Citizens Association. And we see in this one Dorothy Stevenson, Councillor Stevenson, or Councillor Mrs. Stevenson, as she was known as in those days. Unfortunately, shortly after she retired, she actually passed away. Yet she was one of the most long-standing social reformers in the first half of the 20th century in Cambridge. There is a biography about her waiting to be written by somebody, because she achieved great things, along with her two colleagues that we see in these two photographs, Mrs. Weber and Mrs. Hartree, in particular Eva Hartree, who became the first woman to be elected Mayor of Cambridge, and was the person ultimately who, you could say, got us Drummer Street bus station. Because the proposal, I think at the time, was to have a bus station and a car park at Drummer Street, and quite understandably a lot of residents opposed it, because it's just like, no, this is, this is Christ's pieces, you can't build it here. And about 300 protesters, after a gathering up at Drummer Street, decided to rock up to her house, as it shows here on 21 Bentley Road, so a long way down Trumpington Road, to protest. But she managed to face them all down, and in the end got it done. We see in the next series of photographs Clara Rackham and Mabel Fell. Mabel Fell is someone who I really want to find out more about, because she was the person who campaigned successfully for Cherry Hinton Hall to be effectively bought out and taken over by the council. And it's one of the reasons why we can still go up there now, because she was the one who campaigned for and moved the motion for Cherry Hinton Hall ultimately to be taken over by the council. Clara Rackham obviously is well known in these parts. We put a blue plaque up for her for all of her achievements. Started campaigning on all things votes for women, and also against the mean poor laws, and that was in the early 1900s. And in the end, she finally finished campaigning with the CND against weapons of mass destruction and nuclear weapons, based in the UK. Finally, I do need to take better care of this. We also had, and I'll finish this one here, we had members of the University of Cambridge on Cambridge City Council, which seems quite strange. We had 4 councillors and 2 aldermen who were elected by, in various different ways, by the university authorities and the university membership. And so for all the complaints, in particular on planning, that we have with the university, actually here seems to be a method of actually how those councillors or the university could be held accountable one way or another for what they did. The most interesting person actually out of the ones that stand out here for me is Councillor John Venn. He was the son of the person who invented the Venn diagram, but actually the two of them did a lot more, in particular for the Cambridge Antiquarian Society, of which they were both members of. Anyway, I shall leave that there as a run through for some of the councillors that stand out, and parts 2 and probably part 3 will come soon.